So my name is Kris Woolery, and I'm here to talk to you about packaging theory for practice. And really that is going to be a focus on inclusive design as it relates to a toolkit that my team worked on for the past 2.5 years. But before I do that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. This is my family. This picture was taken in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. It's about 45 minutes outside of where I grew up. I grew up in Nashville. And the reason why I wanted to share this is that in many ways, my upbringing in Nashville has really informed the work that I do today and the path that I've taken throughout my career and also my education. So I grew up in an interracial, intercultural family. My mom is from Indonesia and ethnic Chinese, and she came to the States as a teenager and met my dad at the University of Arizona, which he's wearing on his shirt. And my brother and I both grew up in Nashville being mixed race in a racial environment that was very much dichotomous black and white. So if you're Asian and you grew up in the South, you feel me. You didn't really exist, especially in the 70s and the 80s and early 90s. And so really trying to figure out like how you show up in spaces is an interesting question. And so for me, it really made me attuned to exclusion very early on, also representation, issues of passing, and all these things about how do you participate and how do you move in and out of different groups. So this is sort of my context. I went to school in Massachusetts, which was a huge culture shock, and studied women's studies, and then from there went to UC Davis because I thought I wanted to be a cultural studies professor and studied community development, specializing in ethnic and cultural diversity. So the first part of my career, I like to say, spent a lot of time with condoms, flip chart paper, chef's knives, and youth, which should raise some eyebrows, and there's no ooh in the room, so I'm a little concerned. So I spent the first half of my career, about 10 years, in the nonprofit sector designing youth programs. So youth development programs, which are very much asset-based, really thinking about like what are the capabilities and the opportunities that young people already have and how do we support them, right? So I did this through HIV prevention education, then social justice education, and then finally culinary-based work in DC. So the thing that was in common about all of these programs was that I used participatory action research as kind of the foundation for how I thought about designing these programs. And really all that means is I worked with young people, found out what do they want to learn, what's the best way to engage them so that they'll come back, because it's up to them. They were teenagers for the most case. And what would actually be relevant to them that they would want to share with somebody else, right? Like what will keep them coming back? So a lot of that's about engagement. And what you should know is that I went back to school in 2007 to get my MBA and studied strategic marketing. And I learned, I already knew marketing. I had no idea that like everything that I was doing in the nonprofit sector was basically marketing. But what was also most important to understand was that I was already thinking about who the users were, who were the participants, and that was something that was the consistency between the past and the future. So I left business school and became a strategist. And so I've worked as a creative strategist, I worked as a digital strategist, a brand strategist, and now my title is senior design strategist at Microsoft. So I've been exposed to lots of different design disciplines, and I want to kind of provide that as context for you as I move through this conversation about what the Inclusive Design Toolkit is and sort of the origin story of it and then how it could potentially be used. So today, I spent a lot of time thinking about computers or digital experiences, still a lot of flip chart papers or whiteboards. Now there's a lot more sticky notes, and then, maybe not so many youth, but a lot of youthful people are still involved. So in the background, this is sort of my career prior to Microsoft, and these are examples of where I took a lot of the community-based work that I was doing, the methods of really participating with people in the process and bringing it into the design industry. So the first image is doing a co-creation session with consumers, right? Getting out there and doing some design research and thinking about what is the experience, what is this retail experience that they would aspire for, that they'd want to visit, they'd want to come back, and how does it fit into their life? The second one is really, getting clients engaged in a process where they can understand what brand expression means. Like, how do you bring a bunch of engineers into a conversation about the visual expression of their brand, right? And so this was a facilitated session. So a lot of my role was thinking about how do I engage people in these conversations? What is the conversation we need to have? What is the sort of abstract theory that people are going to have a hard time understanding, and bring it into something practical? And so in the last one is really just working with a client, these are some of my coworkers, thinking through a product portfolio of a brand so that we would understand how to organize it for the packaging and sort of the hierarchy on the packaging. So there's a lot of opportunities for thinking about experiential education within the context of design, and I've actually had a great opportunity to do it in many different settings. Which brings me to Microsoft. And I am talking fast because I want to show you a video later. So if I'm talking too fast, somebody like do this or something in the audience. So now I'm at Microsoft, and I'm a part of Microsoft Design. And at Microsoft Design, we have a small team that has really been committed to thinking about inclusive design and how we can scale that across the company. So what that means for me is that I've spent a lot of time thinking about what is curriculum like in this context? What is sort of the creative stimuli, what is the research stimuli that we can create to have these experiences that will impact the way that we create our products and experiences? So a lot of that has been creating design sprints, setting some best practices for facilitation. Not everybody has facilitation experience. I'm way more used to being in the audience and interacting with people than I am up here with slides. So this is sort of the, just a little snapshot of what we've been doing, and this is not what I'm going to actually be talking about today. So you may want to hear more about inclusive design as a topic, which is usually what we do when we come out to these conferences, is we really want to get you all on board. But this is a rare opportunity that I can actually talk about the toolkit that we pulled together and how you can start thinking about using it and some of the things that we've learned in the process. So today I'm going to be talking about the what and the why of the toolkit. I'm also going to be talking about some of the lessons learned, and then hopefully leaving you with some things that I feel like are still left to be explored. So some of you in the audience may be thinking, what is a toolkit, and why is Microsoft doing it? I know some of you are thinking that. So I think that's a really good question, because there's two parts to that. And the first part of it is that, toolkits often get a bad rap, right? I have a nice informant in the audience, and we had this great discussion about toolkits. And some toolkits are really thought of as being one and done, right? Or maybe they're too difficult. You already have to have a lot of understanding of a topic in order to be able to use the tools. Or it's just the opposite. Like you just get into it and you're like, I already know how to do all this stuff, and I just spent all this money on this toolkit. Or in some cases, it could be like an artifact left over from what a design firm or an agency has done for a client to kind of showcase their process and how they think. But in many cases, they sort of just sit on a shelf, right? And we wanted to do more than this. Like when we were doing the toolkit, the idea was, how can we really change the way we do things at Microsoft? And I'm in Microsoft Design, which is a very specific part of the company, and we're really trying to think about how can we be more design-led? What are the things that we need to be doing to influence the way that we're creating our products and our experiences? And the piece that really was driving our team was our mission. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with our mission at Microsoft, but the piece of this mission that really stuck with us as a team is, how do you empower every person on the planet? Like, what does that really mean? Like, that's a pretty profound aspiration to have. And coming from the nonprofit sector, those missions, they should be very aspirational. But we wanted to say, from a practical perspective, what does it really mean? And so we've been focusing on that and thinking about, what does empowerment mean? Who are these people that we're talking about that we're trying to touch, and what are some of the challenges that we have in designing for them? Another really big influence in the work that we've been doing was this woman, Susan Goltzman. So she recently passed in 2016, but was a really, really prominent player in thinking about inclusive playgrounds. And so we were doing a documentary about inclusive design, and she was one of the subjects in the storytelling of it. And we really thought it was an awesome metaphor for thinking about digital experiences, because for inclusive design, it's really not designing one thing for all people, but it's really thinking about how can you design a diversity of things so that everybody can participate, right? And with digital experiences, it's a great opportunity to do that, because a lot of them today are created to be adaptable, right? So how do we think about adapting to different contexts and environments in these digital experiences? And so we're very inspired by this, and we've created some activities related to the idea of play and playground. What are the sort of aspirations that somebody has when they're playing, and how can you achieve that, maybe through different kinds of activities? And then this last piece is actually one of the most pivotal pieces to how we think about inclusive design at Microsoft. And this is sort of the redefinition of disability by the World Health Organization. And you may or may not know this. I didn't know it before coming onto the team. But really, disability is defined as being context dependent. It's no longer about a personal attribute. It's really about the mismatch between a person and their environment, right? And so that could be social, it could be emotional. There are many different aspects of what that means to be mismatched in an environment. And so this actually is the piece that really motivates us in how we think about how to make something very practical. Because if you can identify the mismatches, you can identify design opportunities. And so really, whether or not we understood it at the time, we were trying to create a movement. I thought we were Skunkworks team when I came on, and then all of a sudden we had all this visibility. And so it really escalated very quickly. But the idea was that we were trying to change behaviors, and we were really trying to change the mindset, particularly around accessibility. So if you're in the digital space, you've probably been in conversations about how do we make our product accessible, and it's usually about compliance. It's a checklist that often happens at the end of a design process. Well, we really wanted to invert that conversation and say, well, how can you really think about the design process earlier so that you're thinking about the diversity of users at the beginning that will impact your final design? Because we really believe that there's no such thing as normal. And a lot of times in a design process, you kind of have like this normalized, person or archetype that you're designing for that is often not considering some of the edge cases that can be extremely informative to creating these elegant solutions. And so one of the other pieces that we often bring up, and this really helps in the design sprints, is you'd be actually really surprised at the innovation that can come from designing for someone that has very discrete needs and concerns in the design process. So if you think about those design constraints that were once sort of edge case as really cool design opportunities, you actually can create something that would benefit a much broader group of people. So here, we use this thing that we call the persona spectrum. And it's really a great way to think about what is the sort of overall benefit of designing inclusively. And if you design for somebody who, on a day-to-day basis, has access to one arm to engage with your experiences, then how do you, if you design for them, then the benefit from that actually extends out to people who maybe on a temporary situational basis can only use one arm. And so this is something that I think landed really, really quickly with people where it's like, oh yeah, when you have your groceries and your keys and you're trying to do this thing and you get a phone call and you're trying to do something, or you have like repetitive stress injury because your mouse or your Wacom pad or whatever is giving you problems, so you can't do something. And so thinking about that overall benefit is something that we like to talk about as the persona spectrum. So as you're designing for one, to think about who else can benefit from that, and then actually really helps build a case for the feature that you're designing. A lot of people used to say, why would I design for such a small set of people, focusing on sort of the permanent group, right? The people who are living with this on a daily basis. And you're like, well, we all at some point run into these scenarios where we don't have access to both of our hands. And so this is a piece that I think is really compelling, that is really stuck. So what I'd like to do is just kind of give you a sense of, we've only been doing this between 2 to 3 years. It's a short yet long experience for us, and a lot has happened. But the pieces that I really want to focus on are 2015, we first released the toolkit. The manual in the toolkit, which is only called the manual and toolkit because the PDF was too long the first time. And I needed to split them up, so I was like, well, we have a manual and we have a toolkit. But the manual was really just our point of view on inclusive design, and it kind of still is today. It's really sort of laying out, what is inclusive design, how can it benefit the design process, and why would you do it? And then the toolkit initially was supposed to be activities, things that you could do, right? And then we released in 2016 a new version along with some other things, which I'll detail out a little bit later. But in between that time, we tried out these activities with our product teams. So these are things we were doing internally with teams across the company, just trying to sort of stress test our ideas and our theories. And in that process, we learned that there are a few things that really stuck, and the things that were really compelling to people. In the design process, we really emphasized empathy building and the persona spectrum, which I just talked about, and then 3 principles that we wound up distilling after about a year of doing this work. And I want to talk about empathy building for a moment, because empathy building honestly, like I hear about it all the time, especially in the design space. But what we were really trying to focus on is, how do you think about engaging with people as whole people, right? Like as the three-dimensional, multi-dimensional, shift-shifting people that they are, as inspiration for the design challenges that you're approaching. And really what that meant in a design sprint was, when I would create a design sprint, social gaming was the first design sprint that I did at Microsoft. And the challenge was thinking about, how do you design for somebody who cannot use a headset during a multiplayer game? And so I brought in different people who would maybe not want to use a headset, right? So maybe they couldn't hear, maybe they were nonverbal, or they were worried about the perception of who they were based off of their voice, right? So there are lots of people who probably disengage from something like that. So bringing in different people with those different perspectives to a product team to explore all of those things was a way to build empathy. But the thing that I did with them was I said, you're not allowed to talk about technology or gaming until after you can tell me who they are. So the real emphasis was like, who are they? What do they get excited about? Like if it was gaming, like why do they game? Who do they game with? Like how does that make them feel? And then get into the actual nitty-gritty of the technology, because it's so quick, especially in technology companies, to go straight to the interaction or do evaluative kind of prototyping of like what the interaction is, but you never even hear the origin story of why somebody would want to engage with you in the first place. And so a lot of the work that we were doing was about that, but we realized it wasn't scalable. So we had this hypothesis that if you could create video shorts that maybe people could engage in this early thinking that would help them prepare for these conversations with real life people, or at least shift their thinking about how you would approach a design. And that's why I'm talking so fast, because I really want to show you one. So these are the 3 principles of inclusive design. Recognize exclusion, and this is how we use it in our company. People have different principles for inclusive design, but they kind of align with each other. But this is what we decided was most relevant for how we were talking about this stuff at Microsoft. Learn from diversity, because learning from human diversity is like so critical, because humans are experts at adapting. So how can we understand how someone adapts to an environment and be inspired by that in the solutions that we're creating? And then the last one related to the persona spectrum, how can you solve for one and extend to many? So we learned a lot of things in this process. One of which is that when you think about success, you really need to kind of step back for a moment and figure out what does success look like, because there are lots of different cultural variables that can impact success. And people are like, well, what does that really mean? Well, from team to team in one organization, your creative process could be very different, right? And how receptive someone would be to changing that creative process can also be very different. Thinking about how leadership can impact what gets pushed through in terms of being built or made or prioritized, how PM gets involved, how a dev understands the true design intent of what you're doing so that it actually gets built out to specs. So all of those things can really impact your success, and that's a very complicated thing, and it's one that we're trying to think about from an operational perspective. Like, how do we influence those things, and how do we get people involved to make sure that this is something that can actually happen? Oops, sorry. And then just to touch on these very quickly, the principles really helped us bring clarity. One of the things that we learned early on is that like every single one of us on the team was talking about inclusive design differently. And so we needed something to like align to, and being a brand strategist, I knew that right away. So I was just like, okay, what are the things that we can all agree upon that we really feel like really helps move the work forward? And so that's how we landed at those 3 principles. And then what the big piece was that we didn't realize how compelling inclusive design would be outside of the digital experience space, right? So beyond designers, like everybody that we talk to about inclusive design has their own take on it or has their own questions about it. You know, we were thinking primarily on an interaction level, but then you start thinking about social exclusion. Like, what does that mean, right? And so they're big questions that can be asked, and they're big questions that can be answered by all of us in the room in different ways. Which leads me to the last one, which is that there's endless possibilities to explore. Like we create content internally to test out with teams to see if it'll impact the way that they think. Currently, we have some work that, actually there's an article in Fast Company yesterday about bias in AI that our team just released. We've been doing some stuff around focus and learning styles. So there's a lot of opportunities. So if you see something, not just say something, make something, right? Like think about how can you challenge people to think differently about a topic. This is just an example of us having a discussion about thinking about how do you make this move forward after you design sprint. Design sprints are like summer camp. People get really excited about them, and they feel really inspired, and then they're like completely demoralized because they can't move it forward. So before you leave that room, how can you have an action plan? Who is accountable for each of these different things, and who's the person that's going to work with the PM or whoever else that's prioritizing issues, and who's going to really champion that through? So really quickly, 2015, we had 2 things. This is the PDF that was split into 2. These are all of, well, not all of these. The newer versions are available online on our website. And then in 2016, we updated the manual and the toolkit based off of feedback from the people who've been using them internally, as well as people at universities. OCAD has been a great partner of ours. RISD's been a great partner. And different individuals that we've spoken with, like, what are some of the challenges? And so we made some updates based off of that. We also updated our website so that people would find the toolkit much easier and kind of understand our principles. And we have 5 different subject matter expert videos that I mentioned before, which you totally have access to. Totally. And we evolved the design of our cards. Initially, we didn't know what information people would want. I should say we. I didn't. So, and we didn't do our own research process, right? It was like, let's just get this out there, let's prototype it, let's figure out what people want. And what I learned was that people were overwhelmed. If you weren't a skilled facilitator, you had no idea what to do with the toolkit. So what we did was we scaled it back and we rewrote all the instructions. So today, you should be able to go through the instructions, read it to a group, and someone can go through an exercise. But you can also vary it. You can make it your own. The idea is to get you started. And so hopefully you will play around with it, try it out, and see what works for you. These are just some examples of the updates. So I learned as a facilitator that I had to revisit my expertise. You know, I've been doing this with young people and with clients, but there were things like facilitation about what does it mean to have an inclusive session? How do I make sure that someone can get in and out of that door without assistance? How can people have their own independence in that space? How can people move through? Am I moving people too much? And so some of the things that I used to do just as standard practice, I had to start questioning. And I encourage you to also start questioning, what are your sort of standard practices and what are your conventions as you're designing? The other thing is about taking risks. I almost freaked out when we launched the first version because we didn't do the design research that I felt we needed to do. We also weren't experts in accessibility or experts in inclusive design, but the feedback that we got was amazing because honestly, we're all trying to figure it out. This is a new space. Even though there are lots of work that's been done in built environments, to think about it in a digital space, it's still pretty nascent. And then connecting to others. One of the biggest values that our team has had within Microsoft is connecting teams together. It's always been cross-discipline when we do a sprint. I have developers, I have designers, I have PMs, I have design researchers, and I bring them into the room. And I've always had that philosophy when I do things because you can learn from each other. And like a developer knows what maybe is possible, that a designer just has some inkling of an idea, right? And so together you can actually have much faster solutions. And you've probably experienced that if you've been in a hackathon. So I'll leave you with, it's a big world. And I think we could design for it all. Some challenges that I give to you is if you're in design education, really think about how can you start introducing these concepts to students much earlier, right? Like how can we start having conversations about exclusion in the design process? How do we start thinking about building empathy and what are we building empathy for, right? And so all of these things are pretty ripe for development, and I would love to help in any way that I can. We have a video, but I don't think we're gonna have time. We're gonna do Q&A. So, would you like to see a video? Yes. Okay, roll it. Thank you. Is there audio? There's no audio. And no oh, there we go. Well, fortunately, there's captioning.
Everybody was looking at us, and we were the center of attention because we were just having such a good time. And so I've always loved music, but I realized that I could express that music through the way I move my body.
His wheelchair rolls on the dance floor.
You don't just need 2 feet to dance. You need to have rhythm and soul and I've got plenty of both.
Lying on a bed, Victor holds a keyboard and gazes at the ceiling monitor.
I stopped walking when I was about 5 years old. I had gradual weakness in my muscles, and by the time I was in high school, I used a machine to help me breathe.
A breathing tube fits over his nose.
You know, I was watching the movie Matrix. Do you take the red pill or the blue pill? And the question is, would I take a pill that would make my disability go away? And that's a really hard question because I have so much insight and such a rich life that not having this perspective would really change the way that I kind of view the world.
A personal care assistant helps Victor dress.
I'm going to be challenged next week when I have to climb Machu Picchu, which is a lifelong dream. It's on my bucket list.
Victor flies in a plane over mountains in Peru.
And I'm challenged by thinking about how to make that journey possible, but I know that I'll get through it.
Two men guide Victor's wheelchair along a narrow, rocky trail. A lofty view shows a terraced hillside.
There's a triangle, 3 different things that have to come together to really unlock human accomplishment for people with disabilities. And those involve assistive technology, personal assistance, somebody that's aware, understanding how to support you. And 3 is coping strategies. And so these 3 things sort of create a variety of tools.
In a Nevada desert, Victor rides in an ice taxi.
Like my recent trip to Burning Man,
He lies on blankets.
where I had never been camping before because I need some basic infrastructure.
His wheelchair rides atop the taxi.
And so how was I gonna get, a solar-powered battery charger to charge my breathing machine? And how was I going to have my assistant putting me in a tent and having to put me on the floor and this and that? And I challenged myself to sort of put myself in a really difficult place, knowing that I had good people around me and support to get through it.
Shirtless, he lounges in a chair.
So it's really about seeing users and meeting users and engaging with people that can be completely different than you. Stretches your imagination of what's possible. And so by having designers, whether they're designing a school or software, they're able to design ways and functionalities that unlock human potential.
He visits a marketplace.
It not only makes that software, that school, more useful for broader numbers of people, but it has a trickle effect. It has a multiplier effect. That it changes those people, in a sense, it changes society. Because the fact that the designer thought about a wider group of people opens up for society to see these people that were once invisible.
Victor speaks at conferences. A choral group includes some who use wheelchairs.
And the designers have the power to unlock that potential.
He consults on an urban planning design.
As people with disabilities, there is this very clear understanding that you either are able to contribute to society or you're just left out of society. And the tools that you design really change the equation in terms of what I can contribute. So remove those obstacles and let me contribute my talents, because I want to be part of society. I want to give everything I have. I don't want to sit on the sidelines. You can change that. You can change the rules of the game so the game includes me and includes my talents.
Victor eases his wheelchair down a ramp at the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley and exits through a door to the outside. Fade to black. Titles. This is part of a film series created to build empathy and inspire designers. Inclusive, a Microsoft Design Toolkit. A Slanted Light production, Microsoft.
All right, thank you. Oh, I thought I could get out of the questions.
Do we have time?
We don't have time.
We have fun.
Okay. You standing, really? Okay.
No, I'm gonna sit.
Okay.
I'm gonna sit. Here we go. Okay. let's talk.
Okay.
So tell me, how can educators use this toolkit?
That's great. Oh,
You have a mic.
do I have? Yeah, okay. So educators can use this toolkit in a few different ways. The exercises are organized by a sort of a generic design process. So there's kind of like a discovery or getting oriented. There's some stuff around framing up your problem, ideation, iteration, optimizing. So if you already understand, generally speaking, how you approach maybe sort of interaction design with a group of people, then you could sort of look through different activities that could kind of enhance what you're already doing. It was really created to supplement an existing creative process. And the videos, like as you can see, there's probably a lot of different ways that you could use the videos. We've used them to actually prep people for writing discussion guides. So kind of have them think about what they would ask and then like show the video and then say, okay, well, what questions did you ask now, right? Like, and so figuring out, how you can use things to prime people in different ways.
All right. How do we identify and find people to include in our process?
I think that's a really great question. First, you need to figure out what you're trying to understand and why, and who you want to talk with. We actually had that challenge because, at large companies, you sometimes maybe have a panel that you always pull from in terms of people, and it's not always diverse. And so what I do is I went out to some of the universities and built relationships, because a lot of universities will have programs for students with disabilities who are super interested in technology or design or whatever it may be. And then, so we built relationships with them and brought in some of these younger people into our programs. We also have leveraged our social networks and our social media, especially Gaming for Everyone, which I've been involved with. We'll find like really avid gamers, and there are some blind gamers out there that like will video all their gameplay. And so we've made relationships with some of them and brought them in to work with product teams. So you just have to be creative, right? Like put your hustle on a little bit to think differently about how you would engage with people. But always think about the ethics of how you're going to engage with them and what they're getting out of that experience, and really making sure you're very clear about that.
Okay, so that leads me to the last question, which is, I think you kind of touched on it. How would you recommend a designer to get started with the toolkit?
I would just say maybe start reading the manual, which is kind of some things I hinted at first. It kind of gives you an overview of what we think inclusive design is. It's in sort of everyday language, hopefully. And then go through the toolkit and just kind of look. It really says what the exercise purpose is. There's some instructions there. There's like what materials you might need, and just decide like, oh, does this seem interesting to you? Do I understand what it's doing? And just try it. Like, try it with one or two people, or even try it with yourself. Like, can you understand what the instructions are? And if not, let us know.
So speaking of that, how do they get in contact with you, Kris?
Okay, that's a great question. So you can not go to the slide. So at Kris Woolery is my Twitter handle, which I hardly ever use, but I will get it. We also have at Microsoft Design, and then my email is please do not spam me, Woolery@Microsoft.com. And so yeah, any of those methods. And I also have some cards down here too as well.
Okay, so you guys, let's give her a nice warm applause.
Thank you.